what's the interplay between heart rate variability and resting heart rate? Are you looking to discard resting heart rate as a metric, or is it usable still in this new framework?
Yeah, it's definitely still usable. So, like, if you think parasympathetic activity, so more like rest and digest, higher parasympathetic activity is associated with a lower resting heart rate. So, generally, the two go hand in hand. They do have a linear relationship to a point. With people, some athletes who have really, really high or really, really low resting heart rate, so very high levels of parasympathetic activity or vagal tone, as we call it. Higher variability can actually go down. So it's kind of got this polynomial relationship. It's not straight linear. So at the top point, it becomes a little bit more confused. We call it HRV saturation, where your resting heart rate becomes so high, vagal tone is so high that HRV actually drops. So I will always be looking at resting heart rate at the same time as HRV, particularly in elite athletes, because sometimes if you have a sudden drop in HRV, with a drop in resting heart rate, I wouldn't be so bothered as if I had a sudden drop in HRV with an increase in resting heart rate. The great thing about HRV compared to resting heart rate is that we always talk about this kind of signal to noise ratio, in that like HRV will change a lot. It has a very high signal. So that means that through any type of stressor, any change in diet, anything that's causing a change in behavior, you'll generally see a change in HRV almost instantaneously, like the next day. Whereas resting heart rate is a little
better and worse.
Yeah, better and worse, exactly. Yeah, but you won't necessarily see that in resting heart rate. So the noise is a bit more in HRV. So that means that the measure can change a little bit more in a kind of a technical error of estimate way. But the signal is much greater. So it's much better for athletes because you will see changes on a day-to-day basis. Whereas resting heart rate, something has to be really awry to see a substantial change. So if we published a paper on this, and me and Mark Altina, who's the owner of HRV for Training, we published a paper on this that says, if you see a sudden increase in resting heart rate, then you're in a bit of trouble. You definitely want to take a rest day. Whereas if you see a sudden decrease in HRV, it's probably not as severe because it doesn't take as much to shift it. If that makes sense.
It's nearly like the relationship when you started using a power meter for the first time and you were trying to explain to somebody the difference between a power meter and a heart rate monitor. You're trying to explain to them that, look, your heart rate monitor lags behind the effort. So as soon as you put in a stimulus, your power reading's going to go up, but maybe your heart rate won't catch up for a couple of minutes later. Is that a fair way to interpret it, where HRV, if I have a night on the beer, it's going to be instantly affected, whereas my resting heart rate might take a couple of days to catch up if I have a repeated stimulus?
Not really. It's not the lag. It's so much it's the potency of the stimulus. So if I gave you 2 beers, right, the next day you might see a small change in your HRV, no change in your resting heart rate. But if I gave you 10 beers, which, would be very generous to do that, you probably would then see a change in your resting heart rate because it takes just more of a stimulus, more to make that same response in HRV. So things have to be much worse. So you kind of have to be a little bit more over the edge to see a change in your resting heart rate, which is a problem, right? Whereas you can make interventions and changes with HRV much more easily and much more quickly based on small differences. So a little bit, 2 or 3 days of high intensity training, you would likely see a change in your HRV. You might not see a change in your resting heart rate.
I've definitely field tested that one with about 14 beers over in Girona last week. Well, the next day the data wasn't looking too good at all.
There you go. Yeah. And about that, I mean, it definitely shows alcohol's a real one to really kick out your HRV, that's for sure.
But that's actually an interesting segue, because I remember one of the first books I read on training, and it was by Joe Friel, Cyclist Training Bible. I'm not sure if you remember it, but in it, Joe Friel advocates this morning check-in. And the morning check-in is like rate, I can't remember his scale, I think it was 1 to 5. Rate 1 to 5, your fatigue, your readiness to train, all these different areas. And this is what I often wonder with data. Is data, is it a proxy to like understanding our own bodies, and it's starting to drown out the actual voice we should be listening to. Like, how do we feel? Like when I wake up in the morning after having 14 beers, I know I feel like shit. I don't really need my Whoop to tell me I feel like shit. But we're getting a generation of athletes now who are so dependent on that data. And anecdotally, I've had some of my best performances when the data says I feel like shit, but I didn't check it till after.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I always say that no measure is a silver bullet. It's just to reduce uncertainty in the decisions that you're making with training, right? It's not to make a decision for you. And I would never depend on one measure to make a decision either. I think you have to have multiple things coming in at one time. So, HRV is a prime example. If you like, I had this example. I was training quite a lot this year. I was still competing in Ironman, and I'd often, and I've got young kids, and I'd often wake up with like a bit of a head cold, a bit of a sniffle, right? And my HRV was fine during this period, so I would just train straight through because I kind of knew that there was nothing that was causing any kind of change in my internal physiology. My resting heart was normal, my HRV was normal, but I still felt a little bit snivelly and a little bit of a head cold, but I carried on training and I was totally fine. Whereas if that happened to me and my HRV was low or my resting heart was high at the same time, I would definitely have done easy training or stopped training. So I don't think you can't just depend on one thing. It's a few things that you have to look at, and like all measures, there's nothing that's the silver bullet that can make all decisions for you. I think it's you have to use it within your own intuition as well. You can't fall out of your own whatever it might be. And it's exactly the same with exercise prescription. I always say that exercise prescription, people have gone away from heart rate and they've gone away from feeling, they just use power. And it's in cycling, for example. And I always think you've got to always be in touch with the Holy Grail. And I call it the Holy Grail because I call it like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which is the Father's the power, the Son's the heart rate, and the Holy Ghost is how you're feeling. You have to be in touch with all those three things at one time. It's the same for the response and the recovery. You can't just go, oh, look at my HRV. It's pants today. I'm not going to do any training. But, you might think, well, I feel fine. I'm going to give it a go.
So if you like this video, you should definitely check out this video because I know you're going to love it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel.